Vice President JD Vance has been traveling the country to promote the Trump administration's accomplishments. Vance says the president's big bill, which he calls the Big Beautiful Bill, won't act, he says, record-setting tax cuts. Paul Spey checks that claim for PolitiFact.
Did the Trump administration just approve the biggest tax cuts ever? Well, that's what Vice President JD Vance said the other day. He was talking about the legislation that the Republicans call the One Big Beautiful Bill. Here's what he said during a rally in Atlanta.
That's why we increased the child tax credit in the working families tax cut. That's why we eliminated taxes on overtime and on tips. And that's why we had the biggest tax cut for families that this country has ever seen.
Is he right about the bill enacting the biggest tax cuts in history? Well, not quite. Let's take a look back at some of the biggest tax cuts in modern history, starting with 1980. Now, to measure this claim, we looked at the total value of the tax cut from various bills. In other words, we looked at how much each cut would decrease revenue for the U.S. government. Then, to account for inflation, we took the total amount of revenue lost and measured it as a percentage of the gross domestic product. And this chart shows us the results. You can see the largest tax cut was actually signed by President Ronald Reagan in 1981. That's the top bar. As for this year's bill, signed by President Trump, it went down there at the bottom. This is about sixth in modern history. However, this year's bill was largely an extension of cuts Trump first signed in his first term back in 2017. Those were big too. And if we combine this year's cuts with the ones from 2017, the Trump tax cuts become the third biggest in modern history. You can see that from the red bar there. So they're certainly significant, but they're not the biggest in history, as Vance said. And that's why the Truth Meter rates his claim mostly false. Read more about these numbers at WRAL.com.